In the vicinity of the city of Jelgava, ground reconnaissance detected an enemy armored train that was obstructing the advance of our troops to the Riga-Siolye railroad with its fire. Major Denisov's squadron was ordered to destroy the armored train. 6 Elos headed by the commander flew to the mission. From a height of 1,200 meters, pilots surveyed the area, but the armored train was not found. But they saw an enemy train coming with military equipment and ammunition. Attack aircraft successfully attacked it. Photo equipment registered explosions and fires. Then, not far from Jelgava railway station, Denisov found a sanitary train. However, for humane reasons, he did not shell and bomb it. Returning to the airfield, the major reported that the specified target could not be found. But where is the armored train? Perplexed us. The ground troops again confirmed their first report. The armored train exists and is firing. We had to take to the air a second time, and again to no avail. True, Denisov's group bombed German artillery positions west of the railroad bed, but the mission was different. That worried me. What else did you see during the flight? I asked the squadron commander. Nothing except the same sanitary train as the first time. Only he changed the place of his parking lot, replied Denisov. And what if the armored train disguised as an ambulance? I thought. The assumption turned into a certainty when the command of the ground forces for the third time reported to the headquarters of our division about heavy fire raids of the enemy armored train. The major again led his stormtroopers to Jelgava. Having found the sanitary train, he ordered to plan the whole group and from a low altitude to examine it. Having given the command, "Don't open fire," Denisov started the descent from the turn. When he was at an altitude of 200 meters, Sanitary opened heavy anti-aircraft fire on him. Here it is, the clue. The Alias made 4 approaches and bombed the armored train. After the capture of Siolye, the Soviet troops moved forward in the Riga direction for more than 60 kilometers, defeated the enemy grouping in the area of Jelgava, and stormed this city. There was a real opportunity to cut off the German group north from the main forces. To save the situation, the enemy hastily began to transfer their tank formations from Tilsit, their columns numbering at least 1,000 vehicles, at high speed openly moving along the road Siolye-Ioniskis. Jelgava. We learned about it from the Chief of Staff of the Third Air Army, General N.P. Dagaev, who flew to us at the airfield Shadok-Pavartisi. Nikolai Pavlovich unfolded the map, and his exaggeration, Sergei Sergeyevich, is serious. Tanks are trying to get to the rear of our troops. Before the approach of anti-tank artillery, all hope for the attack aircraft. So you will have to work hard for 2 or 3 days. General N.P. Dagaev I knew as a strong-willed, energetic man, from whom staff officers learned the ability to quickly solve complex operational and tactical problems, high demanding and culture in the work. His school passed, and the Deputy Chief of Staff of our division, Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Stepanovich Kulybyakin, and the character of D.S. Kulybyakin was balanced. In any situation, Dmitry Stepanovich did not lose composure. His diligence, energy, in many ways contributed to the coherence of the entire staff apparatus. Lieutenant Colonel had an exceptional memory. He knew almost all pilots by name and patronymic, could always accurately report on the readiness of aircraft, the planned order of departure of squadrons, units and even individual crews. This Kulybyakin demanded from his subordinates. When General N.P. Dagaev left, I gathered at my place D.S. Kulybyakin, Kalugin and other officers in charge. After a brief exchange of views, prepared a combat order and brought it to the attention of unit commanders. K.P. Zaklipa, V.G. Bolotov, and M.V. Baikov reported that all attack aircraft are ready to perform the task. Our airfield was 15-18 kilometers from the road to Siolye, along which the enemy tanks were moving. This distance they could overcome in 1 or 2 walking hours, so it was impossible to delay. By that time, the fighters of the 3rd Guards Division withdrew literally from under the German fire and flew to the reserve rear airfield. Now there were no air units ahead of us. And now at the signal, Captain Denisov's squadron took off. Behind it flew more than 100 attack aircraft. I didn't leave the control panel all day. I hear the voice of G. Denisov in the speaker. Fighter tanks are coming to the airfield. Attack. For a while the speaker went silent. Then among the many voices I heard an enthusiastic exclamation. "One is on fire." Fedoryshev reported that Denisov destroyed the tank from the first run. Sergeant Nepryakhina, a radio operator, told me joyfully. Captain Denisov was one of the best commanders in our division. He was constantly improving his skills, carefully studied with his subordinates the experience of masters of assault strikes, constantly watching the tactics of German fighters and bombers. In the battle must be skillfully, intelligently use all types of weapons of the attack aircraft, bombs, rockets, cannon and machine gun systems, said the commander to his pilots. Our airplane is proudly called winged tank. Its fire must be managed expertly, intelligently and calculatedly. Leading this or that group of attack aircraft, Captain Denisov clearly divided the duties between the crews. Some of them suppressed enemy anti-aircraft points, others carried out bombing strikes on the main target. At the same time, each ensured the safety of his comrade. So it was this time. One group of Ilov suppressed anti-aircraft, the other acted on the tanks. Following the commander in the attack went Fedorishev, Salamatin, Dyakov and Padolko. Senior Lieutenant Fedorikov saw how one tank turned off the road, trying to hide in the woods. A few more vehicles rushed after it. The main column, without slowing down, moved in the same direction. It was more convenient, of course, to strike at those slippers which went along the road, but the pilots first attacked the cars that were trying to escape into the woods. The approach was successful. Stormtroopers destroyed 5 Hitler tanks along with their crews. Now it was possible to pursue the main column, which was rushing to connect with the group norths. And Denisov's pilots crushed it until the approach of squadrons of Majors Makarov and Arefyev. Then there were groups of attack aircraft captains Sadchikova and Kovalchik. They hit the leading and trailing tanks. Movement stalled. Realizing that they could not break through on the road, the German tankers began to leave the formation and escape from the fire of the Soviet attackers in different directions to hide in the woods and ravines. The division, on this day, made about 500 combat airplane sorties, destroyed and hit about 100 tanks. Late in the evening we received a telegram in which the military council of the front declared gratitude to our pilots and commanders for brave actions to destroy tanks and enemy's manpower. The Chief of Army Staff, General Dave, thanked us, thank you, attack aircraft. You acted perfectly. Night was coming. We organized defense in the tank dangerous direction, took measures to strengthen the protection of materiel and the location of personnel. In the morning, the Chief of Counterintelligence Division, Major A.A. Artemonov, reported that a group of saboteurs who tried to blow up airplanes was detained. I presented Artemonov to the government award and personally took the documents to the Army headquarters. General Papivin and Major Artemonov's immediate superior approved the initiative. Soon the vigilant officer received the Order of Patriotic War of the Second Degree. Heavy losses in tanks forced the enemy to change tactics the very next day. They refused from open movement on the road, began to resort to camouflage of vehicles, organized air cover. The first to search for the enemy led a group of attackers Sabatin. Not noticing the camouflage tanks, he came under anti-aircraft fire and did not return from the mission. His subordinates set fire to 3 machines, but they themselves barely brought their damaged Ilya. Sorties of other pilots did not bring much luck. Intense fire counteraction from the ground, as well as increased coverage of tanks fighters Mi-109 and FF-190 interfered with the successful fulfillment of the combat mission. It was necessary to urgently change the tactics of fighting the enemy tanks, which were preparing for a counterattack. We gathered the commanders of regiments, squadrons, and the most experienced pilots, consulted with them. We came to a consensus. One of the experienced crews of the group should go ahead at some distance from the formation and, maneuvering in the direction, to find targets. In the sky rose attack aircraft hero of the Soviet Union F.I. Sadchikova. At the control room was the entire senior staff of the division. Everyone was impatiently waiting for the report of the leading group on the results of the search. And here is the first message from the leader. Target not detected. Reconnaissance continues. The unknown was depressing. We've lost the enemy. Where is he and what does he intend to do? A few minutes later I was invited to the phone commander of the Air Army, General Papivin. What are the reports from Sadchikov? 19 tanks have not been detected yet. Will the attack planes find them? A thought troubled me. I ordered the radio operator Nepriakina to contact the commander of the attack group, but the connection could not be established. The speaker heard only dry crackling. See, flight time was running out, and we were in complete behavior, knew nothing about the enemy or their aircraft. The heart clenched with anxiety. Maybe the Ilus had run into a powerful barrage. Maybe they were attacked by enemy fighters. 10 minutes to the end of the flight. "They will soon run out of fuel," said the engineer of the division with anxiety. He barely had time to say this phrase as we heard the voice of Fyodor Sadchikov. "The task of reconnaissance completed. Destroyed 3 tanks. I have no losses." Returning. Tense faces of officers cheered up. The control room became more lively. I was glad to see the success of the stormtroopers. The main thing but in the 3 burned tanks, and that we found the right method of detection and destruction of point targets. Without waiting for Papivin to call, I asked him to the phone. After listening to my report, the commander ordered the crew members to be commended and the most distinguished to be presented to government awards. As soon as the vehicles landed and we received updated data on the movement of enemy tanks, in the air immediately took off 12 groups of attack aircraft, led by squadron commanders and links. Squadron twice hero of the Soviet Union I. F. Pavlov went to the head of the division. Performing the role of a scout, the captain clarified whether the enemy tanks have not changed the place of dislocation. No, camouflaged undercut trees machines were there where they found Fyodor Sadchikov, not far from a small farm. Apparently, the Nazis were waiting for night to continue their movement under the cover of darkness. On Pavlov's command, the crews attacked the target. In the first run, they dropped bombs. Several pockets of fire arose, cut trees and branches scattered by the blast wave. Followed, Pavlov struck Squadron Inosaridze. Illy bombarded the enemy with rockets. 2 more German machines caught fire. Then a group of airplanes of Captain Chuvina went on the attack, and again over the ground soared red flames. Stormtroopers made a second run, and from the cluster of enemy tanks left a pile of mangled. A more difficult task had to solve the squadrons of Majors A, Arafiev and Nakarov, and Captain Mironon. Tanks, which they were to attack, were dispersed in narrow clearings and had the opportunity to maneuver and fire on the aircraft. As soon as the Ilyi approached the column, they began to shoot at them. Major Arafiev reorganized his squadron into a column in pairs and ordered the crews to hit the head tanks. The approach was successful and traffic was slowed down in the clearing. Makarov's group, meanwhile, attacked the middle of the column, raining bombs and rockets on it. On the neighboring sagebrush, in the same way acted assault aircraft Captain Mironov. Individual tanks broke out from under the devastating fire, dispersing at a considerable distance from each other and hiding in the forests, abandoned buildings, haystacks. The task was to finally finish off the already badly battered Nazi tank column. A simultaneous attack by stormtroopers was now ruled out. We decided to act in echelons. The first echelon was a squadron of Major G. Denisov, armed with incendiary bombs. It split into 2 groups. The first group found tracks on the meadow, but the tanks themselves were not visible. The commander ordered to drop incendiary bombs on the haystacks. The village caught fire, and the enemy vehicles were forced to demask themselves. By that time, the second group came up and began to destroy the enemy in the open area with rockets and bombs. Hero of the Soviet Union, Captain N.I. Chuvin from the 6th Guards, Assault Air Regiment, followed the example of Major Denisov. The squadron commander saw ribbed tracks that led to dilapidated barns and an abandoned cattle yard. Dropping several incendiary bombs, he forced the enemy tankers to leave their hiding places. Here came the second and then the third group of Il Chuvina, which destroyed about a dozen armoured vehicles. Rushed was to the salvation of the forest. The crews of Captain Inosaridze's squadron attacked the remaining tanks. Several smoky fires blazed on the ground. Thus, the 335th Division fulfilled the order of the commander of the Air Army, General Papivi. For 3 days, we defeated the enemy tank column, stopped in the area of Shayoye in Mishkis. Jelga was conducting a review of this operation. The Chief of Staff of the Army, General Dagaev, praised the actions of commanders, pilots and gunners, thanked the technical staff for timely, uninterrupted support of combat sorties. The aviators also received gratitude from the command of ground troops, but we were especially pleased with the letters of infantry soldiers. One of them, signed on behalf of all comrades in arms by Petty Officer Vizgelov, the head of the political department of the Army, Colonel Moskalev, read before the formation of the 826th Aviation Regiment. "Dear comrades aviators," said the letter, "let me thank you for your great help to the infantry. The whole personnel of our unit rejoices at the excellent combat training of the crews of attack aircraft, and we call your airplanes winged slippers and the Germans Death. We wish you new successes in the fight against the Nazis. We assure the pilots that we will beat the fascist scum in a godlike manner until the victorious end. I apologize that I wrote little and hastily. You can't write much in the trench. Goodbye. All the personnel of our unit rejoices in the excellent combat training of the crews of attack aircraft. Mentally repeat the words of an unfamiliar to me infantryman. During the years of military trials, our pilots have truly mastered the art of fighting a very strong and insidious enemy, have long achieved superiority in the air, won the respect and love of friends in arms and the entire Soviet people. The example of selfless service to the motherland first of all showed communists and Komsomol members. They sacredly fulfilled the oath. The orders of their fathers and mothers were faithful to the revolutionary and military traditions of the unbending Lenin Guards. In the 6th Moscow Guards Air Assault Regiment of our division fought Anatoly Nikitich Krivenko. I met him in the fall of 1941 when he arrived in the unit after graduating from the School of Fighter Pilots, having retrained on IL-2. Anatoly quickly joined the unit. Our planes were flying at full range at that time, so they were not allocated fighters to cover them. Anatoly Krivenko and his gunner radiator Shablovsky flew to attack the railroad junction Borovukha, where, according to intelligence, there were enemy echelons with ammunition and military equipment. Immediately after the approach to the target, the attack aircraft was attacked by Messerschmitts, fighting them off. The crew once again dived on the Borovukha junction. There were explosions on the railroad bed. The fires started. On the way out of dive, IL-2 was again attacked by enemy fighters. Krivenko and Shablovsky shot off to the last shell, to the last cartridge. But now the guns fell silent, and Messers, like predators, pounced on the crew. One of the shells penetrated the pilot's cockpit. The shrapnel burned Anatoly's temple. Blood flooded his eyes. Sharply changed the flight altitude, made left and right turns. There were 10 minutes of flight to the front line of our troops. Very difficult 10 minutes. The wound was bleeding, dizzy from overload and blood loss. And then Anatoly realized that he could not escape from the Messerschmitts. Well, he would die together with the car, he would go for a ram. And what about the gunner? He can save himself by parachuting out. Abandon the plane, ordered the commander Shablovsky. The gunner replied that he understood the command, but did not leave the car. It noticed Krivenko. Shablovsky, under any circumstances, did not want to leave the crew commander. And enemy fighters all hit the attack aircraft. Anatoly's cabin was filled with smoke, and then the pilot decided to land the wounded ill on a small area surrounded by a huge swamp. Soon victorious, Messerschmitts went west. Krivenko and the air gunner found themselves behind enemy lines, among the impassable swamp. They doused the airplane with gasoline and set it on fire so that the fascists would not get it, and went east. By morning they found themselves in a birch grove. The whole day they took turns to rest, and at night they set off again. Coming out at dawn to the highway, Krivenko and Shablovsky began to observe the movement of transport. Here appeared a cart. On it sat a rider, a swarthy-faced soldier. Stop. Who is it? Blocked his way Krivenko. Uzbek sapper, answered the rider. The sappers neutralize mines and I take them away. And who will you be? Pilots. Okay, get in. Let's go to our unit. On the third day, Krivenko and his gunner were brought by sappers to the regiment. Friends were glad to see the return of the missing crew. We'll fight again, answering the congratulations of his fellow soldiers, Anatoly said. And he fought, together with everyone chased the sworn enemy from Moscow to the Baltic, and death retreated before the heroic pilot, although he fell into the most difficult conditions dozens of times. Here, too, over the town of Ioniskis, the pilot was also helped by his skill. In this battle, the engine of Krivenko's plane was punctured by a shell fragment. The windshield of the cockpit was splattered with oil. The altimeter showed only 800 meters. We had to land immediately. But where to? The attack aircraft was over the location of our troops. In addition, the pilot did not have time to drop all the bombs on the enemy. Landing with a bomb load was forbidden by the instruction. Still, hoping for his experience, Krivenko asked the regiment commander for permission to land with bombs and tiras. He landed the airplane in the field. He did it with jeweler's precision. Surrounding the car, infantrymen could not find words to express surprise. An elderly, bearded man clapped Anatoly on the shoulder, and skillful. And how many of them, such skillful men? We had a group of attack aircraft, led by the hero of the Soviet Union. Captain I. Mironov successfully carried out the attack. The commander gathered the squadron. He himself turned aside. It was necessary to photograph the results of the attack. The plane had already passed the attacked object, and suddenly it was thrown by a blast wave. The wings caught fire. The flames were creeping along the plating, getting closer to the cockpit. Trying to counter airflow to knock down the fire, the pilot turned the car into a dive. The fire did not subside. How much stamina is needed to pilot a burning airplane without losing the presence of mind? There were enemies below, so Alexander Ilyich was pulling towards the front line. Nearby were flying friends. But what could they do? How could they help the commander? Go to the base, ordered them on the radio Mironov. The commander's plane resembled a torch which carried over the forest. Mironov pushed back the visor of his cockpit. The flames burned his face. With great difficulty, the pilot fell overboard. Above his head flashed white dome parachute, burning attack aircraft carried away into the thick of the forest. A minute later it exploded. Having landed, the crew immediately went deep into the thicket of the forest. The Nazis organized a chase, but soon lost the trail. This happened on the 76th combat flight of AI Mironov. Until the end of the war, the brave officer 68 times led his squadron to attack equipment, manpower, and important strategic objects of the enemy. He was a menace for Hitlerites. In the division, his name was pronounced with pride and respect. 223 combat sorties made during the war. Nikolai Ivanovich Chuvin. What only tasks he did not have to fulfill. Young people called him an extraordinary pilot. Yes, he is indeed a man of extraordinary fate. Nikolai was born in a small village Timonovka near Bryansk. In addition to him, there were 5 other children in the family. As a 5-year-old boy, he was left without a father. His older brother and sister worked at the Kirov factory. His mother took care of the house, raised and educated the little ones. Having hardly grown strong, Nikolai also went to the factory, but he did not give up his studies. He knew that it was difficult to build a new life without education. At the age of 17, he entered the flying club and successfully graduated from it, then the flight school, war, the front, and now on the account of hero of the Soviet Union NI, Chuvin 11 enemy planes shot down by him in aerial combat. None of his sorties is not like the other. Each was different in its own way. I will tell you about one of them. In the area of Naval, the Germans held a height from where they controlled all approaches to the front line and interfered with the advance of our troops. We had to find out what enemy units were located on this section of the front and what their strength was. All attempts to get the tongue were unsuccessful. The commander of the ground troops appealed to the aviators to help. To clarify the task, we sent Nikolai Chuvin on a Po-2. He was explained the situation, showed the height, which was held by Hitlerites. To capture prisoners, we allocated a group of fighters. At night, they moved to the hill and lay down. With the Dawn 6 attack aircraft under the command of Chuvina took to the air. The first to attack the target was the leader. After him hit the enemy and the other 5 crews. In total, they made 6 runs, and now a red rocket soared into the sky, a signal to the attackers to turn the work. The sudden airstrike caused panic among the Hitlerites. Taking advantage of this, the scouts got close to the nearest trench and captured several tongues. The prisoners told what units were in front of our troops, what were their numbers and armor. For assistance in the capture of Tung's ground command announced Chuvin and his wingmen thanks. I have already said that in aviation is exceptionally strong sense of camaraderie and mutual aid. As a confirmation, I will give one more example. A group of our Ilov stormed an enemy airfield. The raid was successful. Fascist airplanes, service buildings were burning, ammunition was bursting. Having completed the task, the attack aircraft took a course to their own territory, and suddenly pilot Milonov noticed that one of the fighter escorts, set on fire by the enemy anti-aircraft gun, went to asking permission from the group leader. Milonov also landed to take aboard his comrade in distress. However, during the run, IL-2 tilted and stopped. The left wheel of the landing gear burst, hit by a shell fragment. A serious situation was created. Hitlerites who were nearby began to surround the airplanes, and then Lieutenant Andrei Demekian rushed to the rescue of 2 crews. "No, cover me, Klyev, I'm going to land," he commanded his wingman. Patrolling Klyev kept enemy soldiers away from the fighter and attack aircraft on the ground. Demekian, meanwhile, made the landing and ordered Milonov, his gunner and an officer from the fighter to blow up the planes. A few shots from TT pistols in the gas tanks, and the machines began to fire. Now quickly to me. commanded Andrei Demekin. The air gunner was placed on the left landing gear, the fighter pilot on the right landing gear, and Milanov squeezed into the gunner's cockpit. Demekin gave full throttle, and the attack aircraft went hard to take off. The whole First Baltic Front learned about the noble deed of our aviators. The battle in the Baltic theatre of military operations continued. The sharply rugged terrain, replete with swamps, lakes, rivers, forests, and other natural obstacles, created serious difficulties for infantry, artillery, tanks, and other types of troops. That is why the coordination of their actions was invaluable for the successful suppression of enemy defences and advancement. Perhaps I will not be mistaken if I say that fighting over roads and on roads is one of the most characteristic features of the war in local conditions. The most fierce battles with the enemy unfolded precisely where it was a question of mastering the highways. This could not help but affect the intensity and nature of the action of aviation, including attack aviation. Regiments of our division were continuously striking at bridges and crossings, pushing the enemy from the roads into forests, swamps, and other impassable places. As mentioned above, at the end of July, beginning of September 1944, most often attack aircraft were aimed by the Army and Front Command to fight against enemy tank groups. The no less difficult task of the ILAV was to suppress enemy artillery, mortars, and machine gun nests. These small-sized targets were easily camouflaged. Often changed firing positions and hitting them from the air presented certain difficulties. Before sending squadrons and regiments to launch assaults on the front line and objects deep in the enemy's defences, we conducted a thorough aerial reconnaissance, the results of which largely depended on the success of the combat mission. Under the control of reconnaissance fighters and attack aircraft were all the main highways through which the enemy transferred or could transfer their strike forces. At the same time, a lot of work was done to photograph the German defences. The data of aerial reconnaissance helped the General Army Command to make a decision to make tangible blows on the enemy. In the compound grew a lot of masters of photographic reconnaissance. These were the crews that were fluent in airplane navigation in any meteorological conditions of the day and night, well versed in navigating and radio communication. Most often on reconnaissance went to the squadron of Captain I. Selyagin, which was called a Special Purpose Unit. Guards pilots Burov, Solovyev, Smirnov, Kuznetsov. Yankovsky proved to be excellent scouts. Shirokov and Ratmanov, first-class scouts, aces of their craft, were sent to photograph especially important enemy objects covered by powerful anti-aircraft firepower. The main responsibility for the technical support of aerial reconnaissance was assigned to the engineer of the 6th Moscow Guards Air Assault Regiment for Electrical Special Equipment, Captain N. Kovalev. The best method of aerial photography was considered to be planned when objects were photographed vertically at an angle of 90 degrees. However, when flying at low altitudes, it gave insignificant effect. In addition, the crews were exposed to great risk. The enemy anti-aircraft artillery opened heavy fire on the scouts. Under the assignment of the Army headquarters, specialists of Kovalev's service designed perspective photo installations shooting at an angle of 45-60 degrees. Then this angle was increased to 70 degrees. The innovators of the 6th Guards Regiment did a lot to improve the quality of photographic reconnaissance. In particular, they decided to equip the attack aircraft photo installation of 4 perspective devices and achieve their synchronized work to get panoramic images. But at first they suffered a setback. When the scout returned and in the darkroom developed the film, it was unusable. Specialists did not take into account that each device has its own shutter speed. The difference in speeds, counted in fractions of a second, gave large displacements of the pictures when the airplane was moving fast. Painstaking work on improvement of the complicated installation began. The search was successful and I, Selyagin, flew out for repeated panoramic photography. Selyagin. The results were brilliant. Successful experimental surveys were also made by Solovyev and V. Kuznetsov. In a few days were photographed Königsberg, forts of the outer and inner rim. The model made on the basis of the photos helped the ground command to develop a detailed plan of storming the city later. All our regiments, the 6th, 683rd and 826th, worked with extreme tension. They blocked enemy airfields, stormed the enemy's tank and automobile columns, bombed artillery positions and concentrations of Hitlerites' manpower. 3 or 4 combat sorties a day became the usual norm for each crew. and sometimes we had to take to the air 6 or 7 times. We applied the method of consistent and continuous impact on the enemy. Squadrons and groups of Ilyushin up to 20 airplanes hovered above the enemy for 25-30 minutes. During 1.5–2 hours in the Hitlerites' location, bombs and rockets were bursting. Cannon and machine gun fire was raging. It promoted our ground troops to fulfill successfully the task set before them. Day and night was heard a formidable rumble at the airfields. Some airplanes landed, others rose into the sky, leaving behind them thick sultans of dust. Engineering staff and specialists of service units worked tirelessly. Between combat sorties, technicians and mechanics, in 30 minutes had time to inspect the material part, eliminate minor problems on it, refuel fuel, oil, air and oxygen, put in the compartments of the 240 anti-tank bombs, suspend 80 RS, put in special hatches ribbons with 300 cannon shells and 1,500 machine gun rounds. People did not have enough time for rest, and often it was so that mechanics and motorists, having spent their planes on the mission, immediately in the parking lot, lay down on the covers and slept a rich man's sleep. And when the attack aircraft returned, everything began a new inspection, refueling, charging. Sometimes there was no time to go to the canteen. And here, as always, care about the people showed the head of the political department of the division, Colonel I.T. Kalugin. On his initiative was organized delivery of hot food for the technical staff directly to the workplace, to the parking lots of aircraft. By the way, Ivan Trofimovich constantly made sure that commanders, political workers, regimental and divisional personnel did not forget about the encouragement of technical staff, the presentation of especially distinguished for awards. He also cared about creating good living conditions for girls' radistresses, gunners, telephonists, food service workers and specialists of other services. They did a lot to ensure combat aviators. Once the division engineer V. Titov, in a conversation with Kalugin, suggested that the technical staff perfectly prepares aircraft for sorties, but the results of the assault never cease. It would be necessary to give people such an opportunity at least once. Ivan Trofimovich came to me and conveyed the engineer's wish. Soon there was a chance to show the combat work of pilots, smashing not far from the airfield enemy tanks. Headed by Engineer Major Mr. Morozov on the Turbulent P. Karachev, S. Glushkov, I. Belozerov, V. Shelnokov, N. Vasyakin, V. Pantushev, N. Dishev, N. Abramov, A. Krylov, and many other specialists from the regiments. The impression was so strong that the eyewitnesses of the attack considered it necessary to hold conversations with their co-workers about the combat work of pilots. This further contributed to the patriotic upsurge among the engineering staff, the development of initiative and rationalization in units and units. In those days, the Pasha compound interacted with the 3rd Guards Stalingrad Mechanized Corps, which was part of the 43rd Army. The onslaught of ground troops was held back by 6 German divisions. Especially strong was the enemy grouping in the area of Nordite. So only from September 14 to 17, 1944, in the interests of the Corps, were raised from airfields 102 groups of attack aircraft. For 4 days of fighting, our crews destroyed 27 tanks, over 200 vehicles, about 200 wagons with various cargoes, suppressed artillery and mortar fire of 3 divisions, killed hundreds of Hitlerites. Admired by the excellent actions of Ilyushin, the commander of the tank brigade asked our air gunner captain R. Prosenko to name the names of the leading groups. Vasily Romanovich began to list, and when he called the name of hero of the Soviet Union, Major Makarov, the brigade commander stopped him. Wait, is it not the brother of our Colonel Makarov, the chief of the political department? He told me that his brother is a pilot fighting somewhere. Combrig and Prosenko connected the brothers by radio. Colonel and Major exchanged mutual greetings and wished each other new successes. In the same day was shot down the airplane of Captain I. Mironov. He landed on a neutral strip. Between our tankers and Hitlerites there was a fight for the pilot's life. Soon Mironov on a tank was taken to the airfield. We heartily thanked our fighting friends. The tank was refueled with fuel and again rushed to the front line. In his review, the Chief of Staff of the Corps, Major General of Tank Troops Sidorovich, highly appreciated the combat work of attack aircraft and named the bravest pilots, including all squadron commanders. Contributing to the development of the offensive of ground troops, the aviation struck at the enemy's accumulation in the area of Prekul, Kretingen, Kartsiani, at floating facilities near Libava and Mel. Here our unit cooperated with the 5th Guards Bomber Division, commanded by the hero of the Soviet Union, General V.A. Sandel. 27 P-2 airplanes headed by the leading guards, Major P.S. and Sky, flew out to bombard the accumulation of tanks and enemy manpower in the village of Kretijan and west of Kartsiani. Split into 3 groups, they dropped a bomb load on the target from a height of 3,700 meters. At this time, the attack aircrafts of Captain V.A. Reitkov suppressed the fire of anti-aircraft artillery, which hit our dive bombers. Squadron Reitkov was the most active in the division. Suffice it to say that only for one day of combat work near Siaulia, it destroyed and put out of action 17 fascist tanks. Here, Reitkov and his subordinates also did not give Hitlerites to raise their heads. But when Svensky's P-2 was moving away from the target, another previously silent anti-aircraft battery came to life. The captain attacked it, dropped bombs, fired guns and eras. However, several anti-aircraft guns survived. After a short confusion, their calculations again opened fire. AAV. Reitkov spiked a second time on the guns bristling with fire. One of the shells hit the cockpit of his plane. Fearless commander, brave attack pilot Vladimir Avrianovich Reitkov, protecting his bomber friends. In this battle, the leader of one of the P-2 groups was Guards Captain L.V. Zaludev. I knew about the extraordinary fate of this pilot from the story of hero of the Soviet Union Ivan Semenovich Polbin. On the night of September 21, 1941, Zaludev's crew was ordered to fly a reconnaissance mission. In the darkness, the pilot saw flickering electric lights moving towards the front line. It was a large column of enemy tanks. The navigator marked the route of their movement on the map. After a few minutes of flight, the crew got into the zone of anti-aircraft fire. On the damaged airplane, Zaludev made an emergency landing. The pilot, navigator, and gunner radiator began to make their way to the front line. While wandering through the forest, Argonov fell behind, but soon he met our infantrymen. They helped him to get to the unit. And Zaludev and Popikin, after a long wandering, stumbled upon a partisan camp. Pilot and air gunner radiator enlisted in the detachment, which was commanded by Officer Podgor. People's Avengers did not give Hitlerites rest. Various warehouses, railway and highway bridges were blown up. Enemy echelons rolled under the sledge. Cities ground under feet of occupants. In one of the cruel fights with Punishers, the commander of the detachment died a brave death. In his place appointed a comrade Alexei, so-called partisans' 24-year-old senior lieutenant L.V. Zaludev. In the winter of 1940 and after 1942, when our troops liberated the cities of Kalinin, Nelidovo, Andreapol, the detachment, led by pilot L.V.V. Zaludev, joined our regular units. In early February 1942, Zaludev and Kopekin arrived in their native aviation regiment and began to fly again on combat missions. In the Baltics, Zaludev repeatedly led a group of Petliakovi to suppress a variety of enemy objects, enjoyed well-deserved authority among aviators. On October 5, the First Baltic Front launched a decisive offensive against the enemy. At the same time, the troops of the Third Belarusian Front entered East Prussia. On October 13, valiant soldiers of the Second Baltic Front liberated Riga, the capital of Latvia, and 9 days later they reached Tukums. Thus, the Kurland grouping of Hitler's troops, which numbered more than 30 divisions, was cut off and pressed to the sea. Going on the offensive from the area northwest and southwest of Siauliai, the troops of General I.X. Bagramian broke through the strongly fortified enemy defense, and for 4 days of offensive fighting advanced up to 100 kilometers, extending the breakthrough to 280 kilometers along the front. During the offensive, the units and formations of the front captured important strongholds of the German defenses: Telisha, Plunchenai, Mezaikai, Trishke, Tuxle, Cedar, Vorki, Kelmi, as well as occupied more than 3,000 other settlements. The pilots of the 3rd Air Army of Colonel General Papivin made a great contribution to the defeat of the enemy. The 335th Air Assault Division was awarded the Order of Suvorov of the 2nd degree for the exemplary fulfillment of the command's task, and the valor and courage shown during the atomic bombing. It was not easy to give us victories over the enemy. There were losses in regiments. Veterans still remember the selflessness of the pupil of Lenin's Komsomol crew, Commander Tolia Blinov. It was a remarkable patriot of the motherland, a disciplined warrior, an executive, internally organized pilot who had the ability to take decisive action. Returning from a combat mission, Natalie noticed that a large number of German vehicles were concentrated on the road. No better target could be found. But how to destroy it if there are no bombs or RS, especially since the Messerschmitts are patrolling over the column? Assuming that Ilyushin intends to attack the tanks and vehicles, the fighters furiously pounced on Blinov's plane. The engine was smoking, and the Komsomolets made a well-considered, calculated decision, turned toward the enemy column, and directed the Black Death in a steep dive. A terrible explosion shook the neighborhood. On the road there was a river of fire. A traffic jam was formed. The surviving cars and tanks sprawled apart and bogged down in the swamp. A young able pilot, Yevgeny Belyashenko, died in the Baltic. His wounded airplane pulled over the forest. At the very ground, the machine ceased to obey the control rudders, and having turned upside down, the cockpit collapsed. I do not remember a single battle of any importance that in it did not distinguish themselves communists. Raised in the spirit of Leninist ideas, they performed heroic feats. For the sake of comrades, spared neither blood nor life itself. I will give one characteristic example. The pilots of the regiment of the hero of the Soviet Union, Lieutenant Colonel V.G. Bolotov, were returning from a mission. Here have already landed groups led by officers A. Mironov and Makarov F. Sadchikov. Technicians and mechanics met airplanes, inspected them, rolled them into caponiers. Everything seemed to be going normally. In the air remained only a squadron of Major P. Arafiev, but soon it approached the airfield. It was urgent to land because it was beginning to get dark, and the field airfield had no means of ensuring a blind landing. Suddenly 4 Focke-Wulfs jumped out from behind the clouds. The regiment commander radioed to Major Arafiev. "There's an enemy in the air. Everyone to land at a low angle." Immediately followed Arafiev's order to his wingmen. "I forbid you to engage in combat. I'm covering the landing." The major distracted the enemy. He hit the fighters from the guns and with a gain of altitude went into the clouds. The Fe-190s rushed after him. Arafiev was counting on it. Quickly turning around, he came out of the clouds and hit the trailing fighter from the cannons, which had managed to escape. The enemy plane tilted, went into a steep dive and crashed into the ground near our airfield, which had already landed attack aircraft Squadron Arafiev. And the commander himself continued to fight with the 3 remaining Focke-Wulfs. One of them managed to attack the Ilyushin. The fire trace passed near the cockpit of the gunner radiator. The IL-2 responded with friendly fire. Fokker smoked and pulled to the west. Now it was easier for Arafiev's crew. The pilot and the gunner prepared to repel another attack, but the Nazis did not risk it. They disappeared into the clouds and never appeared again. The major went to land, but the damaged machine ceased to obey the rudders. The plane landed on the fuselage not far from the airfield. So the communist Arafiev, taking the blow on himself, took the trouble away from his young comrades in arms. In describing the bravery, courage, great devotion to the party of Lenin, it is impossible to overstep the boundary of admiration for Soviet attack pilots. It is not without reason that books, pictures, songs and legends are passed from mouth to mouth about their marvelous feats. They are worthy of eternal national memory. Since the battles on the Memel and Libovivian directions were over, we received an order to relocate to the airfield of Sanayo, which is southwest of Tilsit. The first to fly, there was a group of attack aircraft of Major G.M. Denisov. I went with them, under the wing of the high-water Niemann. Tilsit appeared behind him, carefully examined the terrain, all roads, even country roads planted with trees. Major leads the group strictly along the route, gives instructions to the pilots on the radio. Up to the airfield left 3 minutes of flight. Increase intervals and distances. Here in the triangle of roads appeared a small area. On the sides it is riddled with craters, in the center, unevenness. I'm telling Denisov, I'll be the first to land. Wait for the landing command. On the run, my plane was bouncing around a lot. I circled the airfield several times. I chose the most suitable runway with fewer bumps, then instructed the crews how to act during the landing and the run. Following, the group of Major G.M. Denisov landed and the other 100 aircraft of the division. Soon began to prepare for test flights with a full bomb load. In the planning table included the most experienced pilots. In the first 2 or 3 days after relocating to Zyalo, we picked the most trained crews who were allowed to fly from this airfield. By the time of relocation, The command of the units had changed. Lieutenant Colonel K.P. Zaklipa was promoted. He was replaced by a pilot of the same regiment, hero of the Soviet Union, Major I.A. Moznenko. Lieutenant Colonel V.G. Bolatov was seconded to study at the academy. Instead of him was appointed Lieutenant Colonel Ap. Karpov. N.V. Bankov transferred the regiment to the hero of the Soviet Union, Major D.I. Pomukshinsky. These were young, capable organizers who enjoyed the authority of the personnel. Division headquarters instructed regimental commanders to make an aerial reconnaissance of the area to determine the terrain, the presence of roads and their direction. I myself also studied the area of the upcoming combat operations. To the left and right of the Niemen stretched a lowland, a large area flooded with water. Usually after floods and big rains, the Germans pumped water into the Niemen and drained the floodplain for pastures. To the south we could see dikes planted with centuries-old elms. Along the highways and dirt roads stretched continuous alleys, which served as a good reference point. East Prussia, the nest of German militarism, was heavily fortified with defensive structures, entangled with barbed wire, riddled with anti-tank ditches, full of long-term firing points, artillery of various calibers and armines. The German command considered the East Prussian frontiers impregnable. On January 12, 1945, the troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front launched an offensive. 2 days later, the units of the 1st and 2nd Belarusian fronts moved against the enemy's defense, and on January 15, the soldiers of the 4th Ukrainian Front went forward. The aviation of the 3rd Air Army supported the offensive of the troops of the 3rd Belarusian Front. Attack aircrafts were active in combat. They flew for air reconnaissance of enemy troops all over the Zemland Peninsula, searched for and attacked Hitler's ships in the Baltic Sea, photographed the enemy's battle orders and targets. During the offensive, our troops captured a large part of the Zemland Peninsula, bypassed Königsberg from the north, northwest and southwest. Our division decided to pull closer to the front line, and we flew to an airfield near Königsberg. When all the pilots landed, Guards Colonel I.T. Kalugin, taking off his helmet. What a grace! I haven't flown from such an airfield for a long time. The airfield is good, Ivan Trofimovich, but it is located at a distance of a cannon shot from the enemy, I noticed. Engineers Titov and Baranuk came up to us. We advised them to worry about building shelters for the technical staff in advance. The enemy positions were no more than 10 kilometers away. All the crews were busy near their machines. Mechanics and technicians inspected the aircraft. Pilots and gunners helped them. At the attack aircraft M, Salamatin and V, Striganov gathered almost the entire squadron. Their machines were damaged, and comrades helped to make repairs. Chief of Political Department and I approached the pilots. At that time, a squadron of yaks flew over us. The leader swung his wings, greeting us. The guys must be jealous of us, he said, Major Denisov. What an airfield we landed on. Yes, from such an airfield you can freely take off with additional bomb load, aided Arifiri. Major Mitaev, who had been silent until then, handed me a sheet from his field book. So calculated Comrade General that when taking off from the concrete runway, attack aircraft can take the bomb load almost twice as much as from the ground. Why almost? Hero of the Soviet Union B. Padalko asked. The radius of action on targets does not exceed 20 to 30 kilometers, so it is possible to reduce fuel refueling. So it turns out that the payload of the attack aircraft will be doubled. By the way, how are things with the routes? Addressed Colonel Kalugin to the navigator of the regiment Papsuev. And in all directions of the Zemland Peninsula, replied the major. Also clarified options for action on ships in the Baltic Sea. Again on ships, Captain S. Kovalchik was surprised. Yes, answered instead of the navigator-inspector of piloting techniques of the division Major Labzukov. Again on ships, although it is very difficult and dangerous work. Enemy ships are well equipped with air defense. You can understand the concern of Captain Kovalchik, he said, the regiment commander D.I. Pomukshinsky. He arrived in his squadron young editions, which is still not well enough mastered the flight by instruments. Nevertheless, we will have to fly over the sea, and continued the navigator of the regiment. Look at the location of enemy troops. He pulled out of the tablet map, the only way of retreat for them, through the channel to the Baltic Sea. We looked at the map. Marked with dotted lines, flight paths attack aircraft went into the sea. All pilots and air gunners can swim, asked Colonel Kalugin from the squadron commanders. Probably not all. I, for example, do not know how, replied Stanislav Kovalchik. Nothing, encouraged the Captain Navigator Division Major Petrov. Tomorrow all crews will be issued life jackets. After talking for a few more minutes, the chief of the political department and I went to the command post. Just had time to go up to the second floor, as from the bursting of artillery shells with the sound of glass sprinkled. Everyone stand at the partitions. I ordered the officers, but in the rumble of bursts I could hardly hear myself. The shelling did not stop. Ordering the squadron commander Inazarides to raise airplanes in the air to suppress enemy artillery, I returned to the starting radio station. One of the shells hit the airplane, and technicians jumped out of hiding and began to extinguish the fire. They acted collected, cold-blooded. Engineers Titov and Karakchev, ducking, hurried to the Po-2. A shell exploded near them. Karakchev fell down like a hamstring. His companion sat down unnaturally. Then V.E. Titov straightened up and began to help the corpsman who ran up to lay Karakchev, an engineer of the 826th Regiment, on a stretcher. The Po-2 caught fire. A group of aviators rushed to it with fire extinguishers, and suddenly the gas tank exploded. A stream of fire splashed out. The machine could not be saved. Overhead again the ominous rumble of flying shells, and again the rumble of explosions. I can't hear what V.E. Titov is shouting to me. I see only his gestures. When I approached him, I saw that blood was trickling from the pierced shins of his boots, but the engineer didn't notice it. He stood firmly on his feet. "President, to take off your boots. It is necessary to dress the wounds," I told him. Titov waved his hand and shouted, "Lie down." At that he shook his head strangely, as if he was trying to throw something off it. The engineer was concussed by the blast wave. "There is no time to lie down. Mitt," I answered Titov. "We must go to the start." In the general hum clearly distinguished the sound of running engines. Captain Inosaridz's squadron took off. I'm worried, very worried. If even one shell hits the plane, the whole squadron will die. They'll be blown up by their own bombs. And what will happen to the other planes, to the airfield? Said a minute of worry seemed like an eternity. But now the Ilias are already over the airfield. Well done, Inosarides. Sometime later, the captain reported on the radio. I shot down a balloon that was correcting the firing at the airfield. I'm flying to the artillery positions. The shelling of the airfield has stopped. I'm telling Inosarides. Spend ammunition only to suppress artillery. Roger, replied the commander. Meanwhile, soldiers of the Airfield Maintenance Battalion brought the runway into working condition. To replace the crews of Inosarides flew out a wing of hero of the Soviet Union Platonov. The weather changed dramatically. It snowed, but the captain skillfully led his squadron to the airfield. Aviators thanked Inosarides and his wingmen for prompt preparation for the flight and skillful actions to suppress enemy artillery. The captain smiled. If another squadron had been ordered to fly out, it would have done the same. The officer was right. All our units were on alert. Deputy Chief of Staff of the division, Lieutenant Colonel D.S.S. Kurilbayakin gathered information and reported. No dead, seriously wounded Regiment Engineer Karakchev. Have damage to individual airplanes. Life at the front airfield was getting better. The best crews of the division, especially pilots of the 6th Guards Regiment, flew reconnaissance, extracting data on the enemy, its military equipment and firepower. Guards scouts, skillfully mastering anti-aircraft maneuvers, photographed enemy objects from low altitudes. Pilot Serdyukov photographed a fort on the northern outskirts of Königsberg and a pair of attack aircraft led by Captain Kuznetsov, airfield's aeroplane. Of particular value were the photographs taken by pilot Voronov. Overcoming a strong barrier of air defense, he managed to approach a powerful defensive line southwest of Fischhausen, which covered the entrance to the Spit-Frisch-Nerut. These pictures gave a fairly clear picture of the enemy defenses and communications of the fortress. C.V. Kuznetsov's crew took to the air to clarify the reconnaissance data. At low altitude, the guardsman approached Fischhausen, circled the Spit from the west. On its eastern side, covered with forest, the pilot found a cluster of vehicles and military equipment. The Germans opened fire on the attack aircraft from anti-aircraft guns and machine guns, but V. Kuznetsov is not a timid man. The lenses of his devices recorded the positions of anti-aircraft batteries, areas of concentration of enemy manpower and equipment. Later, this data was very useful for us during the assault on the Frischnerut Spit and was also used by the Command of Ground Forces. Aerial reconnaissance also played a great role in the capture of Pilot. By the time of the offensive, we knew exactly what forces the garrison of this port had. Pilot Sheldov photographed in the area of Pilot convoy of up to 60 vehicles, a railway station where stood 5 trains with military equipment, found about 40 ships of small tonnage. Thus, the air scouts largely contributed to the successful defeat of the enemy in East Prussia. Attack pilots struck at the Nazis near Brandenburg and Heilisenbiel, in the settlements of Skellen, Balgay, Neuhauser, and others. They beat the enemy on his own territory. Hitlerites suffered a major defeat in the area of Skellen, which is 9 kilometers west of Brandenburg. It was in March 1945. Under the onslaught of ground troops, the enemy was retreating to the west. Vehicles, tanks, artillery were slowly retreating on the roads, which had been thawed by spring floods. In order not to create traffic jams, tractor-trailers were pulling stuck vehicles into ditches. The Slav forced the fascists to choose large highways during the retreat, but the asphalted roads were quickly out of order when tanks and self-propelled guns were moving along them. Air Scout M. Salamatin reported that up to 300 enemy vehicles were piled up on the highway that ran through Schellen. Decoded images confirmed the pilot's verbal report. The regiment command made a decision to immediately hit the accumulation of vehicles until a group of attack aircraft headed by Salamatin took to the air. Visibility in the target area was limited. The planes dropped to 100 meters, and from this height attacked the enemy. From the first approach, attack aircraft set fire to 10 vehicles. There was no anti-aircraft defense, so the Nazis, having abandoned equipment, took refuge in ditches. The group of M. Salamatin's group once again hit the column with bombs and rockets. Fires arose, explosions began. Having destroyed the equipment, the pilots shelled the roadside ditches and inflicted great damage to the enemy and manpower. On the approach to his airfield, M. Salamatin met 8 attack aircraft of Major Denisov. It went to the area of Fodorow. According to air reconnaissance, from there to the station Velitnik moved about 200 German vehicles. Not far from Fodorow, Major noticed the railroad bed, going into the woods. Denisov thought as if he saw the smoke of a steam locomotive. Probably Hitlerites were driving up the train to load automobiles going to Velitnik station. A few minutes later, the pilots saw the train. On the open platform stood tanks and guns. An attack all of a sudden, ordered Denisov. Stormtroopers rained down on the echelon. Several bombs exploded ahead of the train on the railroad bed. Some hit the platforms and the locomotive. A huge cloud of vapor, swirling, rose above the embankment. Platforms with guns and tanks flew under the slope. Having defeated the echelon, Ilyushin took a course on the highway on which a continuous stream of vehicles moved. To the left and right stretched lakes of meltwater, and the enemy could not escape from under the blow. Anti-aircraft means of combat he had no. Aircraft divided into 2 groups and attacked the column from the rear and front. With the first attack, aircraft set 20 vehicles on fire. They were followed by several more attacks, and at each exit from them the crews fired at the fleeing fascists from cannons and machine guns. In total, 3,600 kilograms of bombs, 60 Eries, thousands of cannon shells and machine gun rounds were spent. The column of enemy vehicles was destroyed completely. On March 29, the troops of the 3rd Belarusian Front completed the liquidation of the German group encircled southwest of Königsberg. For 17 days, the enemy lost more than 50,000 prisoners and 80,000 killed, and our troops captured as trophies 605 tanks and self-propelled guns and more than 3,500 field guns. Preparations for the storming of Königsberg, a first-class fortress, began. The Prussian capital was defended by a 135,000-strong garrison. Here, the plans of the World Robbery War were once hatched, tanks and warships were built. From here, airplanes took off, which turned many Soviet towns and villages into piles of ruins. The struggle for Königsberg is a school of great combat experience. This operation is very instructive in many respects, in particular the exceptionally close interaction of aviation with ground troops. Our pilots acting in the directions of the main strikes, helping ground troops to beat the enemy out of separate houses, cellars, and other shelters, demonstrated high examples of training, courage, and selfless During the Königsberg operation, they made 14,000 combat sorties, dropped 5,000 air bombs on the enemy's heads. On April 7, attack aircrafts of the 6th Moscow Guards Aviation Regiment began their combat work with the sunrise. First from the airfield rose 80 Lichin, led by twice hero of the Soviet Union, Guards Captain F.A.T. Pivov. Having broken through anti-aircraft fire, the pilots reached the target, the enemy mortar positions, clusters of vehicles and field artillery guns. Planning from a height of 900 meters, they dropped a deadly load on the 15 minutes were alas over the enemy's location. Then came a group of attack aircraft led by the hero of the Soviet Union, Captain V. Solovyov. Having reorganized from the right bearing into a circle, the Guards made 6 consecutive approaches to the huge fires broke out below. The 8 of V. Solovyov, which destroyed about 20 vehicles and dozens of Hitlerites, was replaced by 12 Il-2 under the command of heroes of the Soviet Union S. Yankovsky and V. Nechayev. Echelons of winged tanks went to the enemy until late evening. Under their sniper strikes crumbled defensive nodes in Königsberg and its surrounding suburbs. A lot of creative initiative and resourcefulness was shown in the battles for the Prussian capital. In the political department of the division and party organizations of the regiments analyzed, generalized combat experience and made it available to all crews of the comp. For this purpose, political workers, party and Komsomol activists held talks directly at the planes, issued leaflets dedicated to distinguished pilots and air gunners, designed photo displays and montages, showed photo documents confirming the results of assault sorties. A great mobilizing role in the propaganda of heroism of aviators was played by the army and frontline press, local radio broadcasting. Despite huge losses, Hitlerites fiercely resisted. With persistence of fanatics, the fascists defended in Medeno, northwest of Königsberg. For suppression in this area of artillery and mortar positions, the regiment commander I.A. Musienko allocated 5 crews of attack aircrafts. All pilots of this group, Ivan Shabelnikov, Nikolai Balenko, Dmitry Tarasov and Arkady Voronov, were heroes of the Soviet Union, and Ivan Korchagin, who flew 126 combat sorties, was presented to this high rank. Leading the way was Ivan Shabelnikov, an equal among equals in the heroic 5. Having approached the target, I became in a circle. Such a combat order allowed to cover a comrade and alternately attack a given object. The planes made the first run, dropping bombs on artillery mortar batteries. The enemy responded with hurricane fire. When leaving the dive, one of the shells damaged the plane of Ivan Korchagin's machine. However, the pilot did not leave the formation. "Let's make a second approach," ordered the commander, and the attack aircrafts again one after another rushed to the target. This time, Hitler's anti-aircraft gunners managed to damage Balenko's and Tarasov's airplanes. They became difficult to control. "Go to your airfield," heard the voice of the leader. 3 Il-2s remained on the battlefield. They barely had time to make one more approach to the target, as in the air appeared Focke-Wulf's 190. At Ivan Shabelnikov's command, the attacking aircrafts closed in a tight ring. 6 wheeled-out 190s struck the leading plane. Ilyushin smoked and immediately went down. Ivan Korchagin followed the commander, counted every minute, expecting that he was about to cross the front line. But Shabelnikov's machine was already out of control. Having somehow landed, the crew commander and air gunner Radio Mankov climbed out of the cockpit and, shooting away from the Nazis, rushed towards our ground troops. Cutting off the pursuers, Ivan Korchagin and his gunner hit them with guns and machine gun. On the right focus, warned wingman Arkady Voronov. Turning to the left, Korchagin gave the gunner V. Smatov to aim fire at enemy planes. An accurate turn, and one F-190 went down with a stone. 5 Hitlerites then together threw themselves on Voronov or Korchagin. Then, having divided into groups, attacked both airplanes at once. Fighting back, stormtroopers pulled to the front line. On their side and the ground helped, but the forces were unequal. Wounded Il barely kept in the air. A few hundred meters from the front-line, enemy fighters concentrated fire on Korchagin's attack aircraft. The shells hit the engine. The machine was shaking like a fever. The catastrophic situation forced the pilot to make an emergency landing not far from the position of our Katyusha. I. Shabelnikov and V. Malkov fought off Hitlerites to the last cartridge. In the firefight, both of them were seriously wounded and captured by the enemy. After interrogations and tortures, they were thrown into the prison of Pillow City. Then, during the retreat, the Nazis transported the pilot and the gunner to Denmark. The Soviet patriots endured horrors of Hitler's captivity, but nothing could break them, neither torture nor hunger. Both of them did not give up hope to get out. In the middle of April, the Allied troops released the prisoners from the camp where Shebelnikov, was. Together with two other our officers, he got a car and they went to their own. Viktor Malkov also returned to his homeland. In the last battles with the enemy, Ivan Shebelnikov died a hero's death, and his comrade in arms, with whom he made about 130 sorties for assault, together with his comrades in arms, met the long-awaited Victory Day. After the war, Viktor Malkov graduated from the institute and now works as a director of a large factory. The troops of the 3rd Belarusian Front, after persistent street battles, completed the defeat of the encircled group of German troops and captured Königsberg, an important strategic node of German defense on the Baltic Sea. So only for the day of April 9, 1945, more than 27,000 German soldiers and officers were taken prisoner. A large number of weapons and various kinds of military property were captured. The remnants of the garrison, led by the commandant of the fortress, General of Infantry Liash, and his staff, stopped resistance and laid down their arms. For assistance to the ground troops in defeating the enemy, the personnel of our unit received commendations from division commanders, corps commanders, army commanders, and the commander of the 3rd Belarusian Front, Marshal of the Soviet Union M. Vasilevsky. The Soviet army was successfully advancing deep into the Zemland Peninsula, seizing settlements, railroad stations, strong fortified areas of the enemy. In April 1945, our troops came to the important defensive object Neuhauser, where Hitlerites concentrated a large number of mortars, tanks, and infantry. There were huge warehouses of ammunition and military equipment. When the first group of attack aircraft, led by hero of the Soviet Union Captain Rudnev, appeared over the Neuhauser railroad station and saw the sanitary cars, the commander ordered the wingmen, "No, do not bomb sanitary cars." To clarify, the target made another approach. The enemy opened heavy fire on the planes. In the planes and fuselages appeared holes. Then Rudnev gave the suppress anti-aircraft artillery fire. It turned out that under the guise of a sanitary train disguised train with ammunition and troops. By the way, the fascists often resorted to such a trick. Having figured out the enemy's trick, the pilots delivered a devastating blow to the target. The train loaded with ammunition exploded, burying hundreds of Hitler's soldiers and officers under its debris. On the same day, heroes of the Soviet Union Plektonov, Kovalchik and Tikhonov led their groups of Ilovs to the Neuhauser area. A strong fortified point, which stood in the way of our troops' advance, fell, and the ground units of the Soviet army moved forward, to the west. Not allowing the enemy to concentrate, stormtroopers pursued him on the way of retreat. In the settlement of Portnin, a group of crews led by hero of the Soviet Union Pyotr Ivanovich Matkov created several fires. The movement of Hitlerites was suspended. The squadron of hero of the Soviet Union Major N. J. Makarov completed here the defeat of equipment and manpower. Especially active were pilots G. Krasovin, Volkov, and Drozd. The remnants of the Zemland group of Hitlerites were concentrated in Pelou. Enemy ships and barges were running around the clock. Some brought ammunition, others took away valuables, industrial equipment. It was necessary to lock the enemy fleet in the port, to localize its activities. For this purpose, the headquarters of our division ordered the commanders of regiments to prepare for combat sorties several groups of aircraft. I must say that our attack pilots had to operate in unusual conditions. They were accustomed to landmarks, and in the sea they were almost non-existent, as far as the eye could see, stretched water space. True, some crews had a little experience in airplane navigation over the sea. During the battles in Finland in the winter of 1939, I also had to drive my regiment over the Gulf of Finland and the Gulf of Bothnia, in the area of Hunko Island and Vaasa. We passed these bits of experience along with the general rules of flying over the sea to all crew commanders before sending them on a combat mission. Hero of the Soviet Union S. Kovalchik was appointed as one of the leaders. The navigator in his group was Officer Papsuev, and now ATL-2 took a course to the area of Pillow. Having reached the target, the pilots noticed several self-propelled barges leaving the port with cargo. The commander was the first to lead the plane into the attack, followed by the wingmen. Fire erupted from the sea, but the crews have long since learned to use the anti-avoidance maneuver and continued to attack marine transport from low altitude. Then the pickup dive bombers joined the work. The enemy caravan with looted goods could not escape. Heavy, bloody battles for the city and fortress of Pillow began. It was necessary to force the channel connecting Königsberg with Pillow and the Baltic Sea. 2 air armies and long-range aviation units cooperated with ground troops. On the approaches to the channel, Hitlerites concentrated almost all artillery of Zemlansky Peninsula. For the convenience of firing, they cut off the tops of trees and cut off the limbs. From the sea were firing ships covering Pillow. The Wittenberg airfield, on which the Pasha Division was based, was first class. It had a well-equipped command post, comfortable housing for pilots and technicians, and most importantly, a concreted strip to take off with an overload option. 600 kilograms of bombs, 80 ARs, and a full complement of cannon shells and machine gun ammunition. We knew the locations of anti-aircraft facilities, the dislocation of German airfields, as well as the number of aircraft on them. The higher headquarters ordered to sink 3 enemy ships travelling along the canal to Pillow. This task was assigned to a group of attack aircraft led by hero of the Soviet Union Peter Ivanovich Matkov. Siksilov came in from the northwest, from the side of Königsberg. In 2 or 3 kilometers from the power station bays, located on the canal, the pilots were shelled by anti-aircraft artillery. Matkov ordered the wingmen to drop 2 bombs on the anti-aircraft guns on the fly and fire on them from cannons. 4 crews rushed to the enemy ships, and pilots Izheim and Tugarev continued to suppress the positions of anti-aircraft batteries with rockets. Fire from the ground suddenly stopped, and 4 EEU-190s appeared in the air. Our cover fighters tied up the enemy in combat, and the attack aircraft continued to fulfill the combat mission. Meanwhile, Matkov and 3 other pilots set fire to 2 Nazi ships and began the pursuit of the 3rd ship, leaving in the open sea. The enemy's floating caravan did not reach Pillow. Attack aircraft safely returned to their airfield. To help the garrison blocked in the fortress moved infantry and tanks. Our division was given the task to destroy them. To fulfill this task again flew a group of P.I. Metkov. Italy attacked a cluster of tanks and artillery at firing positions north of the road Königsberg. Pillow. Spring thaw did not give the Hitlerites the opportunity to turn off the road and take cover. Within 30 minutes, the attack aircraft destroyed 12 tanks, 7 anti-aircraft artillery guns, and 8 vehicles. The enemy failed to break the blockade ring. Attack aircrafts of our division, in cooperation with ground troops, sank ships, bombed railroad junctions, tank and automobile columns, exploded field and anti-aircraft artillery guns, derailed trains. On April 17, 1945, the powerful resistance node Fischhausen was liquidated and the way to the sea fortress, Fort Pillow, was opened. The remnants of the Zemland group pressed against the sea, desperately resisted. They had at their disposal a large number of tanks, self-propelled guns, mortars, field and anti-aircraft artillery of all calibers. 200 250 airplanes, mostly fighters of the FF-190 type, were based on the northwestern tip of the peninsula and on the spit leading to Danzig. This grouping was supported from the sea by ships. Hitlerites combined defensive battles with counterattacks. However, the initiative was completely in the hands of the Soviet troops. Circumstances were such that the greatest load during this period was carried by the 826th Vitebsk Assault Aviation Regiment. Squadrons of this unit made 3-4 combat sorties a day, operating on convoys, tanks, and the enemy's front line. The technical staff barely had time to prepare the machines. On April 14, 1945, the squadron of Captain F.I. Sadchikova received an order to fly out to attack enemy artillery and mortar positions northwest of Königsberg. Other units of this unit left to attack enemy ships. The group gathered over the airfield and, having built up in the right bearing, under cover of fighters took a course to the front line. Cloudiness reached 5-6 points, so the airplanes were flying at low altitude. Approaching the front line, they reached an altitude of 1750 meters. The cloud cover cleared and the airplanes were fired by small-caliber anti-aircraft artillery, then began firing and heavy anti-aircraft guns. They were the target that the attack aircraft were to destroy. The battery was camouflaged to the right of a small village, not far from the forest. An attack, ordered Captain Sadchikov his subordinates. Following the other pilots to the battery turned his car, and Vladimir Gulyayev. In front of the engine there was a scoop of explosion. The plane shook. In the cockpit smelled of cinders. Looking at the planes, Vladimir made sure that there were no holes. Il-2 obeyed the rudders well. Gulyayev gave a line of guns and machine guns. The trails passed above the target. The pilot pushed the control knob further away from himself and pressed the throttle again. The shells and bullets lay exactly in the center of the battery's firing positions, and the guns fell silent. Apparently, the servants had taken cover in the crevices. A rocket fired by Vladimir hit the shield of the anti-aircraft gun. Then Gulyayev pressed the button bomb thrower, and 16 25-kilogram bombs sprinkled from the hatches. Well done. That's right. That's their way. Come on in again. I heard someone's voice in the speaker at the command post. Having successfully accomplished the task, the Group FI, Sajikova safely returned home. On V. Gulyayev's plane, an enemy shell punctured the tire of the right wheel of the landing gear. However, despite this, Vladimir skillfully made a landing. I remember well the sortie of P.I. Matkov's squadron to attack the northern fort of Palau. Shea Ivanovich conducted pre-flight training together with the fighters, who were based with us on the same airfield. The commander told the pilots where the enemy anti-aircraft facilities are located, chose the most favorable attack option. Head of Operations Department, Captain Key Matsegora, clarified the location of our troops. At the same time warned that there might be ships on the roadstead. Then planes rose and took a course for Pillow, in the area of which worked 8 attack aircraft Captain Sadchikova. Motkov asked a comrade in arms to report on the radio situation. Sadchikov reports on the roadstead ships. Be attentive. Assumptions NM Matsegora confirmed. Before the fort was 7-8 kilometers. Matkov built a group in the right bearing. Barely had time to do this as the attack aircraft hit dozens of anti-aircraft guns. Crew commanders vigorously performed an anti-aircraft maneuver, and jet shells attacked the enemy anti-aircraft gunners. One link of Ilov remained for final suppression of Hitlerites' gun positions, and the other 2 went to the fort. We strike at the coastal fortifications, radioed the squadron commander. The bombs hit the ammunition depot. The explosion shook the fort. All around, covered with continuous smoke, there were several pockets of fire. The anti-aircraft artillery of enemy ships began to talk. However, Matkov's group continued to attack. The 2nd, 3rd, 4th approach. It seemed that the land and sea were engulfed in fire. During the last run, the ship's artillery shot down the airplanes of Alexander Piskalov and Stefan Bondarenko, entering Hitlerites to the west, seizing forts and cities, breaking powerful defense nodes. The Soviet troops were approaching the day of victory over Nazi Germany. But not all soldiers liberators were destined to live till May celebrations of 1945. Death snatched our friends from our ranks. Avenging the enemy for their fallen comrades in arms, the pilots increased their efforts, showed true examples of bravery, courage, and calmness. One of such fearless airfighters was Michael Salomatin, a blond young man of medium height, a Komsomol member. At the age of 22, he received the high title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Dozens of times, Michael went on aerial reconnaissance and always returned with valuable information about the enemy. Will you take a day's rest? Major Denisov asked Salomatin. Listen, Tint, after the war I will rest, comrade commander, he answered the pilot. Twice Salomatin landed on a plane damaged in battle outside his airfield. But even then he pulled out the film cassettes from the cameras and brought them to the unit in time. We made extensive use of the photo documents that Mikhail supplied us with. In front of me are some front notes made by Mikhail Ivanovich Salomatin. On February 20, 1945, I stormed artillery and mortar positions near Königsberg, made 2 combat sorties in a group. During 5 sorties destroyed 5 guns and 7 mortars together with servants. On February 21 flew to the same area as part of a group. We made 6 sorties. The Germans lost 4 guns and 10 mortars. On March 13-16 our squadron destroyed in the area of Fischhausen more than 200 vehicles with combat cargo and manpower, more than 40 guns and mortars. Every day we made 3-4 combat sorties and made 5 fix approaches to the target. March 18. Assault and bombing raids on an accumulation of enemy manpower and equipment in the area of Schellen. During 6 combat sorties, the group crashed 57 vehicles with ammunition and manpower. The target was attacked 11 times. March 2022 in the area Volitnik destroyed a lot of enemy equipment and manpower. There are many such records in the flight book of M.I. Salamatan. They give a clear idea of how our brave attack pilots fought in the enemy territory. How long ago, it would seem, arrived to us with the replenishment of Lieutenant M. Goroshansky, and here in East Prussia, he has already become Deputy Squadron Commander, hero of the Soviet Union A, Mironov, under whose command the graduate of the flight school mastered the school of combat skill, instilled in him the best qualities inherent in the Soviet aviator. The commander believed in the abilities of the young attack aircraft, and from day to day assigned him more and more responsible tasks. In one of the battles, when the eye of Captain Mironov's unit was flying at breakneck speed out of the attack, the enemy anti-aircraft guns badly damaged the leading aircraft. The commander ordered Rozansky to lead the group, and the pupil of the hero coped with the task perfectly. Mironov himself on the burning plane pulled across the front line and jumped out with a parachute. Returning to the airfield, the squadron commander thanked the lieutenant and asked me to appoint Goroshansky deputy commander. The division was still based near Königsberg and continuously conducted combat operations. In order to increase the capacity of the airfield and reduce the time of readiness for departure, I decided to make parking lots close to the runway and appealed to the commander of the 11th Guards Army, Colonel General K. Galitsky, for help. "How many sappers do you need?" asked the general. "1 battalion for a week." I thought to myself, he won't give it. He asked a lot. I was wrong. The commander immediately ordered to allocate to my disposal 2 battalions of sappers for 2-3 days. For 2 days, while there was fog, they built excellent parking lots. All this time I was at the airfield, and somehow I was urgently summoned to the division CP. Air Chief Marshal Novikov had arrived. I was wearing cotton pants and a jacket, soldier's Kurzov boots, a Nushanka hat. It was more comfortable. Put on a helmet and ready to fly. In this form to present myself to the Chief Marshal to report to him. Alexander Alexandrovich understood my embarrassment. He did not make a comment to me and offered to go to see the airfield. "Already in the car?" he asked. "How are the parking lots? Are they equipped?" I reported to him that everything was in order. "How big are they?" "In the parking lots can be based not only attack aircraft, but also bombers," EI replied. Inspecting the re-equipped airfield, Air Chief Marshal was satisfied. Then he talked with pilots and technicians, thanked them for their success in combat work, immediately urgently decided the issue of some rearrangement of personnel, and warmly saying goodbye, having seen off A. Novikov, I went to the headquarters. I was invited to the telephone. On the wire was General Kondratyev from the headquarters of the 5th Shock Army. "Hello, Sergei Sergeyevich," he said. This alarmed me. Kondratyev, as a rule, called everyone by rank and surname, and only in exceptional cases by first name and patronymic. I know that the low cloud cover, that visibility is limited, that fishing is more dangerous than anti-aircraft guns. I know everything. But the Army Commander, Colonel General N.D.U. Krylov, asks me to help the infantry. 2 Ferdinands are obstructing its advance. Tell the pilots that the troops are advancing waist deep in water. There's no way to bring anti-tank artillery. We're counting on you. It's clear. References to bad weather are more than inappropriate, and I answers. "We will help, Comrade General." Take a map, C. Kondratyev suggested. "The situation is as follows. Under the onslaught of our units, the enemy is retreating in the northwestern direction. We need 1 breakthrough, 1 effort, and the troops will fulfill the combat task. Forcing the river, take a new bridgehead for further offensive. But on the river near the heights there is a bridge. The Ferdinands are hitting from it. We must take them off." "We will, Comrade General," he said, and then thought, who should I send to scout the weather in such inclement weather? The choice fell on many pilots who flew in any meteorological conditions. However, he still decided to fly himself. Cloudiness pressed the airplane almost to the ground. I noticed that the leading edge of the wing and the cockpit windshield were twitching with a crust of thin ice. This is what I was most afraid of. Icing is a great danger. The ice shell covers the wing, rudders, and then the machine loses stability and finally, controllability. The weather was bad all along the route, but the combat sortie could not be cancelled. The infantry was waiting for the help of aviators. Having landed, briefly described to the pilots the ground and weather situation, conveyed the request of the commander of the 5th Shock Army, expressed considerations for the destruction of Ferdinand self-propelled artillery guns, then asked, "Volunteers are there?" Frankly speaking, I wanted to fly to the task such a complex and responsible, flew Captain B.M. Padalko. Quite recently, on April 15, 1945, Boris Mikhailovich and his wingmen, Lieutenant Dyakov and Junior Lieutenant Kaliv, went to suppress the enemy's self-propelled artillery installations, which were holding back the advance of our infantry units. Despite the harsh weather conditions, the unit coped with the task perfectly and was awarded the commendation of the commander of the 5th Shock Army, Colonel General N.I. Krylov. I look at the pilots, all concentrated, silent. Which of them will respond to my call? Padalko, Mironov, Zadchikov, Makarov, and suddenly the formation took a step forward. Without waiting for me to call the names, the squadron commander, Major Georgy Denisov, and his deputy, hero of the Soviet Union, Boris Padalko, asked to entrust them with the combat mission. I could not risk both leaders of the unit at once. I had to refuse Major Denisov. Captain Padalko himself chose his wingman, Lieutenant Fedorich. We worked out the flight route together, outlined options for hitting the target. Seeing the pilots off, watch out, Boris Mikhailovich, for icing. If necessary, land on the fuselage. The pair took off and immediately disappeared from sight, and soon the hum of the engines subsided. The attack aircraft were flying at low altitude, so radio communication was interrupted. I sat at the command post and, looking at my watch, tried to determine the location of the cruise. Dozens of questions troubled me. What was the weather on the route? Whether the attack aircraft had deviated from the set course? Whether the airplanes were iced over? Every minute seemed like an... And suddenly the phone rang at the control center. I heard the joyful voice of General Kondratiev. "Thank you, Sergei Sergeyevich. Your pilots are real snipers." The Ferdinands were silent. It was as if a mountain had fallen from their shoulders. Padalko and Fedorishev had successfully accomplished their task. But suddenly it began to snow, and anxiety for the cruise of Ilyushin again engulfed all those who were at the command post. The tension was diffused by a calm report of Captain Padalko. "I am in the area of the airfield, but I can't see any airplanes in the snowfall. I take the microphone and report. No, 15th, you're above me, come in for landing." The first to land was Fedorishev, and the captain during the second approach got into a heavy snow charge. We were worried about the outcome of the landing. It was possible to land safely only with the help of commands from the ground, because the pilot could not see anything in the snowy whirlwind. In height of 3 meters, I transmit on the radio. Take off the throttle. Turn off the engine. The attack plane landed at the ravine at the end of the airfield. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. I got in the car and ran to the end of the runway. I saw the plane was intact. The pilot was alive. He stepped briskly towards me. "The Comrade General, the mission has been accomplished." "Thank you, Boris Mikhailovich. Thank you from me, from our infantry." The next day, the head of the political department of the division, IT Kalugin, suggested to the regiment commander, DIT Pamukshinsky, to organize a meeting of Boris Padalko with young pilots. "Maybe they too will have to go on an assault in difficult weather conditions," said Kalugin Pamukshinsky. "Let them learn what experienced crew commanders do in such cases." In a conversation with young people, Captain Padalko told in detail about his flight to destroy enemy self-propelled guns. It was an instructive conversation. His young co-workers listened to the hero with great attention. Headquarters and political department of the division, regimental commanders and their deputies on political part, constantly organized the exchange of experience of advanced aviators, pilots, technicians, other specialists. This helped to improve the combat effectiveness of units and subdivisions, the growth of professional skills of personnel. Very effective was the competition for the title of Master of Air Radio Communication. Its participants had to answer a number of questions on the theory of radio construction and the design of the receiving and transmitting device, to be able to tune the radio, to contact a correspondent, to transmit a cipher text. As a result of the competition, the authoritative commission awarded the title of Master to D. Pamukshinsky, I. Pavlov, B. Padalko, SLU, Kovalchik, and other pilots. Asya Neprayakhinya, Zoya Kolosova, and their friends Ivanova, Kartashova, Kovaleva, all girls who had passed a good school of training from the engineers of the division and regiments. were excellent at radio communication. Start and other radio stations serviced by them always worked clearly and smoothly. In the second half of April, the fighting on the Zemland Peninsula took on an increasingly fierce character. Acting in the interests of the 11th Guards Army, the 335th Air Assault Division struck Hitlerite garrisons in the fortress of Pillow, enemy forts, accumulations of equipment, artillery and manpower, sank enemy ships in the sea. The decisive offensive of the troops of the 3rd Belutian Front ended successfully. On April 25, the last stronghold of the German defence on the peninsula, the large port and naval base of Pillow, fell. In the order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, along with other distinguished formations, our division was also noted. By decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR No. 343, it was awarded the Order of Lenin. This significant event coincided with the 75th anniversary of the birth of Vladimir Ilyich, the brilliant leader of our Communist Party, the organizer and leader of the country of Soviets and its valiant armed forces. The celebrations in the division turned out to be a demonstration of mighty patriotism. Many young aviators in those days became communists, and in the remaining days before the great victory fought the enemy heroically. The order to redeploy to the field airfield of Ors, received on May 7, did not take us by surprise. We had already prepared flight maps, laid out on them the route to the area of Outsee, established the order of sorties, developed a plan for relocation of technical staff. And here we are flying over the coast of East Prussia flooded with spring waters. On the left side of the route we can see the Baltic Sea and the Niemen flowing into it. The rays of the sun are reflected on the mirror surface of the river. Memel, Palanga, Lipajai, Prekul can be seen ahead. Familiar places. I remember heavy battles in these places. At the airfield we were met by Colonel Kretov, commander of the Attack Air Division, whom I knew from the Finnish War. To the evening of May 7, a call. I pick up the phone. At the phone, commander of the Air Army. Tomorrow at dawn begins a lot of work. You have to make 3 or 4 divisional sorties. Ordered General Papevich. Yes, sir. Allow me to go to the troops to the front line to give additional instructions to the air gunners. Permission granted. Followed the answer. The area of the upcoming hostilities was relatively close. We are approaching. Here just ended a bloody battle. On the ground lay a dead sergeant with a grenade in his frozen hand. He had not had time to throw it at the fascists. Someone warned me. Dangerous, Comrade General. Enemy snipers are shooting. Go to the shelter. Having found the commander of the unit, I discussed with him all the issues of interaction. By dawn I returned to the airfield. May 8, 1945. The morning was unusually good, sunny, which is not so often in the Baltics. Before the combat flight, I told the pilots about everything I saw on the front line. In addition, he passed on the testimony of prisoners, any of the Hitlerites to kill another if he moved to the rear of his unit, behind the marked border. These were suicide bombers. Stormtroopers went to smash the remnants of enemy troops. The first half of the day was tense. Pilots have already made 2 sorties. After noon, our planes literally closed the sky over the surrounded grouping. In the camp of the enemy began to appear white flags. Hurrah, hurrah, spread the airwaves with a victorious cry. Immediately followed the order to the crews in the air. Stop the attacks. Drop the bombs into the lake. The Kurland group capitulated. Suicide bombers, despite the fact that the bulk of the troops surrendered, continued to fire at the attacking aircraft. Some machines were seriously damaged. Illy hero of the Soviet Union Captain F.F. Sadshikova and his wingman V. Gulieva to such an extent were riddled with bullets and shell fragments that it was difficult to land on them. The pilots, having made 3 combat sorties each that day, congratulated each other, thanked their combat comrades, air gunners, technicians and mechanics. It was the last day of the war. On May 9, we received the order to return to Labo. We warned the pilots to act calmly in the air, not for a minute to forget about the rules of piloting technique on takeoff, route and landing. I flew to the airfield with the 1st Echelon to supervise the landing of the rest. Radist Sergeant A. Nepriakina reports. On the approach of the 6th Guards, flying our illustrious heroes. And suddenly, what is it? Squadron Commander Hero of the Soviet Union, Major N.I. Shuvin gives a radio order to the pilot. We're approaching the airfield. Increase speed, smooth slide, fire from all cannons. His example was followed by other groups. Salute in the air. It turns out, being on the route, The crews heard on the radio the official government message about unconditional surrender of Hitler's Germany. Here it is, the long-awaited victory. We walked to it for 4 years. A long march, but we reached. The stormtroopers saluted our motherland, the party, the Soviet people. They made a salute in honor of the glorious attack pilots of the 335th Vitebsk Aviation Vitebsk, Order of Lenin, Red Banner and Suvorov Second-Degree Division, who honorably fulfilled their patriotic duty. How many times the guys looked into the eyes of death. Some were repeatedly shot down, landed on a broken airplane anywhere, in the field, in the swamp, in the forest. Hero of the Soviet Union A.I. Mironov 6 times ejected with a parachute from a burning car, and death always retreated before him. In the evening, the whole garrison of Labio saluted. The thunder of the salute rolled through the neighborhood, everyone with a gun fired. We continue to work hard, creating a training base, classrooms, ranges, firing ranges. Combat training is in full swing. A few days after the victory held a 3-day training camp, where the pilots told about the most instructive combat episodes. Recorded speeches formed a golden book of frontline experience of aviators attack aircraft. Soon I, as commander of the compound and the head of the garrison, had the opportunity to present orders to the personnel of the division. Regiments lined up at the local stadium with battle flags. On the right flank, the banner of the 335th Vitebsk Order of Lenin, Red Banner and Suvorov Second Class Air Assault Division. Then the banner of the 6th Moscow Guards Order of Lenin and Suvorov Second Class, Red Banner Assault Aviation Regiment. The commander of the unit, hero of the Soviet Union, Major I. Musienko. In the regiment grew 20 heroes of the Soviet Union. It's the pride of all aviators, twice hero of the Soviet Union, Captain Enfenduev Pavlov. In line ahead of their squadrons, heroes of the Soviet Union officers N. I. Shuvin, Esky Yankovsky, I. N. Selagin, T. Tessin Daymenko, Av Smirnov, Shi Mashanin, D.V. Tarasov, V.V. Kuznetsov, V.B.A. 683rd Polotsk Order of the Red Banner and Suvorov Second Class Air Assault Regiment. Its commander, hero of the Soviet Union, Major Depomukshinsky. Next to him, hero of the Soviet Union, the best leader in the division, Major 3. Emisov Squadron Commanders S.M. Kovalchik, B.M. Padalko, R. Rudnev, P.K. Andreev, Me Salamatin, N.F. Fedorishev, G.M. Inosaridze and others. 826th Regiment. At its head, Lieutenant Colonel Karpov, AP Squadron Commanders, heroes of the Soviet Union, P. Afiev, I. Mironov, N.G. Makarov, V. Sadchikov, officers I. N. Matkov, V.P. Sukachev, N.S. Platonov, V.V.s Striganov and others. There came a solemn minute. Read the order on awarding aviators orders and medals. One by one approach pilots Tarasov, Platonov, Sorokin, Zelentsov, Izhim Krasavin, Draz, Tikhonov, Luktov, Konovalov, Papsuev, Polyakov, Zetkov, Vedanikov. Then the division engineer Titov, senior squadron technicians Borodin, Oreshin technician Link Markovsky, air gunners, mechanics and other aviation specialists. Congratulations, applause. Brief response speeches awarded. Tsarvitsa in honor of the Soviet motherland, the Communist Party. Then with a minute of silence we honored the memory of fallen in battle heroes. Squadron commanders Rykov, Subbotin, deputy squadron commanders Solog, Serenko, Dyakov, Burakov, Bondarenko, Belaninko, Pisklov, air gunners Alexandrov, Nikolaev. But the bitterness of loss does not slouch our shoulders. The enemy received due retribution. The brigand army of fascist Germany is defeated. The victorious flag of our motherland flames over the Reichstag. The soldiers of our valiant armed forces, including the aviators of the 335th Air Assault Division, who brought up 4 generals, 27 colonels, about 40 heroes of the Soviet Union, honorably fulfilled their patriotic and international duty. They are sure that the younger generation will be worthy of their fathers and older brothers. It has someone to make a life from and something to defend. Almost 6 years passed imperceptibly behind the affairs. The fall of 1953, in the troops began preparations for exercises. In the process of this work, officers and generals familiarized themselves with the novelties of special domestic and foreign literature. My attention was attracted by an article which said that the aviation of NATO countries in the joint exercises in 1952 made 3,800 airplane sorties. This is an impressive figure. It was time to test the mobility and combat capability of troops. their ability to conduct offensive and defensive operations in mountainous, rugged terrain. On the first day of the exercise, after artillery and aviation treatment of the operational and tactical depth of the tank and mechanized units rushed forward, aviation cleared the way for them, suppressing individual resistance nodes. For the first time in the practice of the Soviet Army Air Force, we used fighter jets as attack aircraft. Singly and in groups, they attacked ground targets in gorges and canyons, and later our experience was spread to many aviation units. We were assigned the task of landing an airborne landing in the mountains, on a small plain surrounded on three sides by deep canyons. The column of military transport planes took a course to the landing site, which was at an altitude of more than 2,000 meters. Suddenly, the wind changed direction sharply. I ordered the flagship of the group to change course by 9 degrees. All with excitement waiting to see how the landing will happen. On his actions depends on the success of the operation. I give the command to eject the paratroopers. From the fuselage of the leading aircraft separated point, jumped the commander of the paratroopers, I thought. The dot was increasing in size. Time to open the parachute, 400, 200, 100 meters to the ground. You could understand our condition. A minute later, the sky flashed white domes. The paratroopers had landed in the specified area, and from the west, about 5 kilometers away from us, were frontline jet bombers. They bombed the troops of the enemy, which intended to cut off and destroy the airborne landing. Everything was going their way, but the thought that the first parachutist crashed did not give rest. The heart clenched to the point of pain. Fortunately, there was no emergency incident. The parachute was ejected, packed tools for excavation work. Marshal of the Soviet Union Lagavorov, who checked the exercise, called me to his CP. He was carefully watching the landing of the airborne troops. The first thing he asked me about was the parachutist's unsuccessful jump. I explained what had happened. "Well done, paratroopers. Your bombers also performed well, General," said Lagavorov. At the review of the exercise, Marshal gave a high assessment of the training of the troops of the district. He noted that all the tasks aviation has solved successfully, but most of all I was happy that our crews made many more sorties than NATO aviation in 1952. This is the merit of pilots, navigators, gunner radiators, technicians and aviation specialists who replaced the frontline soldiers. They demonstrated high combat skills, which they acquired through the experience of the Great Patriotic War. Day after day, the aviators improved their skills, persistently overcoming difficulties. And there were many difficulties. One of them was mastering high-altitude flights in mountainous terrain. Major Kondrashov was flying his plane over the mountains, and suddenly the weather changed dramatically. The sea-stormed clouds hovered over the very crests of frothy waves. A thunderstorm broke out. The command center worked with extreme tension. On the indicator of the circular view then disappeared among the interference, then reappeared mark from Kondrashov's plane. To make a landing at any of the nearest airfields was out of the question. The thunderstorm raged for dozens of kilometers around. For a moment, the bright lightning light illuminated the bizarre outline of a mountain range. We saw how the hurricane uprooted the trees on its slopes. Jim front seemed to be chasing the pilot. The navigator-operator reported the altitude minute by minute. 8,000 meters. 9. Someone asked anxiously. Would Kondrashov break out of the thundercloud? In the dark room, a greenish-blue screen was glowing. Its cold light magically attracted the eyes of those present. Suddenly, bursts appeared on the radar screen. The plane was at an altitude of 11,000 meters, an incredibly high ceiling for the time. The storm was subsiding. The sky was clearing. Having stood the test in the fight against the elements, Major Kondrashov reported that he had reached an altitude of 11,200 meters and, turning sharply, went to his base. This kind of experimental flight became the property of all pilots. Now the thundercloud over the mountains was not terrible for the aviators. They knew that the flight and tactical data of modern aircraft can overcome high altitudes. 30 years I served in aviation. 30 years together with my combat friends went on air campaigns, and suddenly circumstances were such that 3 days and 3 nights in a row I had to be at the controls. Then immediately, without rest, went up into the air. It was necessary. At first the flight went normally, but on landing I felt that I was losing strength. That's it, I've flown away. A disturbing thought flashed in my head. According to the conclusion of the competent military medical commission, I parted with the sky forever. but I still meet and correspond with my combat friends and comrades in arms. We were always united by common goals and thoughts. People came to the division with different characters, but soon they acquired the features of the best soldiers of the unit, became real air fighters. They developed a sense of army camaraderie, collectivism. This is a great merit of our political workers, party and Komsomol organizations. They skillfully explained the tasks set by the party and the government to defend the fatherland and defeat the Nazis. They united and cemented the collective. The friendship born in battles will never fade.